Hi. Aloha. We are not meaning to interrupt the conviviality and the wonderful kind of reconnecting and getting back in touch with old friends and family. But I would like to just do one thing before we proceed through the rest of the dinner, and that is to introduce the board members. And what I'm going to ask the board members to do is to just stand and introduce themselves, and kind of sprinkle around the room. So if I can begin with our chairman of the board, Bert Brown. So will you stand and introduce yourself, Bert? Thank you. And then just kind of moving across the room, I'd like to ask Glenn if you'd introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Glenn Machu from Los Angeles. I'm Uncle Pat and Essie Lily's nephew. That's why I'm on the board.
And then moving to my left, Karen, please, and you'll have to model both items.
My name is Karen Ishizuka, and my claim to fame, like Glenn's, is that I am Uncle Pat's niece and Auntie Lily's niece. And I had to say that I told the fellows this morning this afternoon that Uncle Pat always introduced me as his favorite niece because we were both in the field of mental health. So we would see each other at early Asian American social workers organizations. So I always teased him that he never introduced me as his favorite niece when his other nieces were around. But at that occasion I was. So the board wanted me to mention that these are my Auntie Lily's authentic Jackie O faux pearls. So yeah, I was lucky enough to have these. And I guess the other one is that I'm from Okura, and my mother was, as Glenn's mother and my mother were sisters of Pat's. And my mother passed away very early on. And so the Okura side of the family has been really important to me. So when my son and I decided to get matching tattoos, and he wanted something from my side of the family, we both got the Okura Mon. So this is the Okura Mon. And it's also
Thank you, Karen. And for those of you who would like to get a closer look, after dinner, she's available to just model that. Which reminds me, by the way, that we have some video cameras rolling just to record the occasion because we want to have it for historical purposes. And then just because we thought some people may want to add a little personal comment or a little oral history, seriously, then we're inviting people to go to one of the video cameras after dinner and provide any comment or oral history you'd like. And then we'll have it recorded and it'll be really nice for historical purposes. But just so I don't forget to move on to he's our host for this event because Phil Hallen made arrangements for us to have this meeting here at the Cosmos Club. So we want to certainly thank and recognize Phil for that and all of his work. And so Phil, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. I'm Phil Hallen. For 40 years I ran a private foundation in Pittsburgh. It's worked in the mental health field called the Falk Foundation. And but mainly along with Steve Hirsch and Frank Okura, we were Bert's therapists through his entire career.
That's right. Thank you very much, Phil, and your services are continually needed. We just wanted to make those introductions. We will be making further introductions later. And right now, all the guests are invited to please enjoy your dinner. And then after dinner, we'll be back with a round of additional introductions and a very special speaker. So please enjoy your dinner. Good evening. Good evening. Everybody having a good time? Absolutely. I'm sorry? That's okay. I think we can manage. We hope you've enjoyed your dinner. I think you're kind of finishing your dinner up. I hope most of you have, and I hope you enjoyed it. We are going to be making brief introductions of some of the folks. I'll begin, and then we'll have a very special informal presentation by a very good friend of the Okuras. But it's my privilege to make a few introductions. I will just identify a group of community folks, and they will just be introduced and recognized. Sorry, there's another event going on over there, and I was kind of wondering what was going on. But it reminded me, though, that one thing the Okuras wanted, and the Okura Foundation has worked on, is a way to catalog and to archive all of Pat and Lily's papers. They had quite a few boxes of papers and things that they wanted to have saved and cataloged, including photographs, formal papers, personal papers, and things of that sort. And we're very pleased because they had made a decision, Pat and Lily, to have the UCLA Asian American Studies program take on the task of doing the archiving and the cataloging. And we are estimating that in September, that archiving and cataloging process will be completed, so that any researchers or people interested in history of the Japanese American and Asian American community, and people interested in Asian American mental health issues, they will be able to go to the UCLA Asian American Studies website, and they will be able to use a keyword and research the archives. And we hope that it will be a real resource for people interested in the field and people doing research around Asian American mental health, as well as civil rights and all the things that Pat and Lily were involved in. So we wanted to be sure to mention that. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce. I'll just identify these people, and I would like, as I introduce you, if you just stand so people will know where you're seated and who you are. So in terms of people from the community and friends of the foundation, I'd like to introduce Priscilla. If you just stand, Priscilla Uchida, who is the National Director of the Japanese American Citizens League. And then also a very close friend and a financial advisor to the Okuras, and also currently with the Okura Mental Health Leadership Foundation, is T.J. Atkinson with Merrill Lynch. And is Lisa still here? I'm sorry? Okay. I will, well, I'm not sure when Lisa will be back, so let me just mention that Lisa's still here, but I wanted to introduce Lisa Strauss, who is the Executive Director of the American Psychological Foundation, which is a kind of partner with what we're doing, and her office is here in D.C., and she was here a moment ago, and she'll be back. Also, I'd like to introduce Martin Iguchi, who's a colleague and a friend and somebody that Pat worked with particularly in relationships with the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And Martin is correct me if I'm wrong, the Dean of Nursing and Health Sciences at Georgetown University. Also, I'd like to introduce David Mineta, who's the Demand Reduction Deputy at the Office of National Drug Control Policy, and his wife, Christine. So stand up, Christine, and Dave. There you go. Handsome couple. And also, even though he'll be introduced a little bit later, I'd like to introduce Norm Mineta. Excuse me, Norm Mineta. Sorry. Yes. I'm so choked up, Norm. God. Right. And Danny Mineta. So if you would stand, please. Thank you. And Lisa, this is not fair, but while you stepped away, we actually went around introducing people. So I want, Lisa, if you wouldn't mind standing, introducing Lisa. Thank you. Lisa Strauss, Executive Director of the American Psychological Foundation. And I'd like to introduce Peggy Saika, who is the Executive Director of the Asian American and Pacific Islanders in Philanthropy. So all the way from San Francisco. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So now I would like to turn the podium over to Karen, who will also be doing some introductions. Karen?
Thank you. Thank you, Ford. First of all, I have the honor of introducing the fellows and our grantees. But I have to say, my cousin Glenn and I were talking today after the meeting and saying how much Auntie Lily and Uncle Pat would have loved today to see all of his good friends, Bert and Phil, who have meant so much to him over the years. And the fellows, Uncle Pat and Auntie Lily didn't have children of their own. So Glenn and I and the rest of our cousins were really recipients of a lot of their love that they would have given to their own children. But, the fellows really provided a special place in their heart. And each and every one of you, they just had so much. They always talked about you. They were so proud of you. And thank you so much for being here and for remembering them and making their lives so rich, and for us to be able to continue on the Okura tradition. So, what I'm going to do is have each of them, if you would stand up loudly, because this room has bad acoustics, to tell us your name and maybe what year you were a fellow and where you are now and what you're doing. So just, very briefly, if we could start with this table.
This table? Hi everyone, I'm Mary Ann Yoshioka. I was a fellow in 1999. I'm currently the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs at the Columbia University School of Social Work, and about to move to be the Dean of the Smith College School of Social Work July 1st. Hi, I'm Rose Lee. I am the President and CEO of Rose Lee and Associates. We do science management and research administration. I'm also currently a candidate for Maryland Delegate, District 16. And
Hi, I'm Tina Liu Tom. I'm a fellow from the year 2000, and I'm currently a staff psychologist in Hawaii at the Minor Coast Comprehensive Health.
Hi, my name is Emily Ihara. I was also an Okura Fellow in the year 2000. I'm currently an associate professor and director of the undergraduate program at George Mason University in the Department of Social Work.
Hi, I'm Russell Lim. I was a fellow in 2002 as faculty at UC Davis, health sciences professor, and I'm a community psychiatrist and a mental health professor.
My name is Jonathan Hurd. I'd like to let Karen and Glenn, as a family and the board, I'm appreciating to be a part of this family at school. I was a refugee from Laos, and I have been in school in my new army. I work for Social Security in South Carolina.
Hi, my name is Lee Sean. I'm a 1993 and I currently direct the Center for Global Studies at Okura University, teach American government and Global Studies at Okura University.
Hi, my name is Dennis Cal. I was a 1998 fellow. I'm currently an assistant professor at the University of Houston, Graduate College of Social Work. We'll be starting a position at the Cal State University of Fullerton, their Department of Social Work in the fall.
I'm Margaret Shimada. I'm a social worker, class of 1993, and I'm currently the development director for a therapy clinic in Los Angeles.
All the fellows, and then we have some of our grantees here, and it was really terrific. This afternoon we had a meeting with the fellows and the grantees, and it was such a great exchange of ideas and passions. I think many brought up that we don't have a single voice for API mental health, and that's something that we could all work toward. So if we could get the grantees to introduce themselves. And now, Kevin.
Hi everyone, my name is Kevin Vidal. I'm the president-elect of the Asian American Psychological Association. My day job is I'm an associate professor of psychology at the City University of New York.
Hi, my name is Francis Yun. I am with the Asian Pacific Islanders Social Work Educator Association, and we are one of the grantees. And currently, I am a professor of social work at California State University, Sacramento.
How's everyone? My name is Craig Ishii. I am the executive director of a Los Angeles-based Japanese American leadership development organization called Kizuna. We're also a very appreciative grantee of the Okura Foundation. Glad to be here.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Gonzalez, president of the Asian American and Pacific Islander Nurses Association. I'm currently the chair of the doctoral program in nursing at Drexel University.
Thank you, Karen. Bert, will you make your way here, please?
I just have a few other friends of the Okura Foundation. The first friend I'd like to introduce as part of a troika. My most beloved executive assistant, Frank Ochberg. I handle my retirement by becoming his executive assistant, and I become executive assistant to 3, maybe 4 of my former executive assistants, and it solved my problem of staying in touch, having the fun, getting none of the blame, except that keep it away from them, and needing none of the credit. And it's very special because Ford Okura was the executive assistant to Frank Ochberg. So that when we honored Frank for his work in trauma journalism, we had this troika of a circle of executive assistants. And it's a practical way that I've shared with many of you of handling your 80s, when you just do the tectonic shift of starting to serve the people who took care of you. So the guy who took care of me, and now I'm trying hard to take care of him, is impossible. Frank Ochberg.
Well, I am the proud grandfather of Akihiro Akberg and Sarika Akberg. So being Asian American to me has to do with literal marriage, as well as the virtual marriage of all of us. And I tell you, there's such a piece in my heart for Bert Brown. And it's Bert who introduced me to Pat Okura and to Lily and then to Ford and to the rest of you who were here. I had a very gratifying experience just this past week when a group who visited me from Japan, paid by the Japanese Ministry of Education, to learn about how to help journalists deal with the trauma of covering terrible things. Not only came and learned, but they ended up winning something called the Akberg Award for their research, and they just wrote to me that they translated their work into Korean so that their colleagues in South Korea could benefit by having better journalism about the tragedy that broke the hearts of the whole nation when the ferry turned over. So Bert, for you, for Ford, for Pat, for Phil Hallen, Jim Espister, the others of us who are, Steve Hirsch, who were here from that era, you did something to make us not just a bunch of smart guys, but I think people with a heart and people who define their catchment area as the whole world, not just Brooklyn or Manhattan where we came from. Thanks a lot for doing that, Bert. We owe you a lot.
Fortunately, the next person to whom I'm executive assistant, and I'm now his, is also my physician. And it's a very special person, Steve Hirsch, who is the head of the Mental Illness Counseling Center, the only other organization that I chair with love. And I'd like Steve Hirsch, who has been a supporter of somebody you'll hear next, take the stage for a few minutes and make some remarks if you have any to make. I forgot to write your notes.
I just was prompted by my wife with 2 words, brief. And correct, and thank you for introducing me, Bert. Frank said it all. He was very, very eloquent on behalf of all of us, and it's interesting how all of us met. I was one of the newcomers. That was 1972 when I first met Pat Okura and Lily. And my only comment is just to focus on the 2 of them and their very special relationship and the work I did in my early years at the National Institute of Mental Health, which back then, remember, included what is now 2 other institutes, alcohol and drug abuse. And Pat and I worked together very closely in terms of child and adolescent mental health, and many of you know his story and his work at Boys Town. And it was just a wonderful privilege to have that experience with him, and a man who was always gentle, always politic, and always kept me from losing my temper in the wrong places. I used to have a terrible temper. He was just an inspiration and continues to be so. So thank you.
A-. I'd like next to introduce somebody who was very special. My predecessor, the second director, Stanley Yolis, found this talented man in the National Library of Medicine, and without consulting with me, his deputy brought him in as the business manager of NIMH. Well, he was so good when the you-know-what hit the fan, and my predecessor, Stan Yolis, was fired by President Nixon and what have you, and I came into the thing. I knew I had a toughie to handle, and my appointment of Jim Isbister as the deputy director over Nobel laureates, doctors, psychologists, social worker, was uniformly despised by my staff until they saw the quality of the human being. Thank God he did well, because when the next time it hit the fan, NIMH was demolished, leaving me alone, and him the head of the Alcohol, Drug Abuse, and Mental Health Administration with everything that I had had, and became my boss. And the thing I'm proudest of in my life, there was no change in our relationship in the 3.5 years he was my deputy and the 3.5 years he was my boss. Jim Ispis, if you'd say a few words about Pat or that period that we all went through together for the 7 or 8 years, I'd appreciate it.
Well, Pat helped it along a lot. Pat was a great guy. We all know that. And being at this event is special for my wife Jennifer and me. And the opportunity to meet all of you who are, in a sense, his progeny through the foundation which he endowed. And it's been a great pleasure to meet all of you, and for all of us to remember that great person, Pat, and his wife, Lily. Thank you.
Now, one of the reasons that Jim and I did well during those difficult years, including the Nixon's resignation and Ford and what have you, is we had a secret power structure that nobody thought anybody from Brooklyn could have, called the Japanese Mafia. Senator Inouye, Norm Mineta, I won't tick them all off. But the key person I dealt with was somebody who was a distinguished psychologist, became president of the American Psychological Association, Pat DeLeon. And I'll never forget my first visit with Pat to Senator Inouye's office when there was the Jewish menorah. And he talked about the rabbi who gave him a year of training. That was a very big moment for me. And Pat DeLeon was the one who was the go-to guy when we had an impossible political problem. And I think he's very brave to come here tonight. Pat, would you say a few words?
Thank you, Bert, and aloha. And whoever brought the very nice cookies, I appreciate it. My wife really will appreciate it later on tonight when you come in. Pat is a very special person, and I used to love the fact that, you know, as Norm knows, elected officials never have time to breathe, right? You're always scheduled, you have to do this. But whenever Pat wanted to bring the fellows up, Inouye, Mr. Inouye always had plenty of time. And it made no difference whether there were other people supposed to see him at a certain time or whether there was a vote. He would just sit down there and let each of the fellows talk about what they were doing, and he and Pat would talk about how you can make a difference, about the war, about American society. And it was just so much fun to watch Pat come in, and Inouye for the rest of the day would be very, very high as a kite. He enjoyed, this is why I got elected for. I started with the senator the first day of the Watergate hearings. Didn't leave until I asked my wife, when is our granddaughter going to start walking? She said, oh, she started 2 weeks ago. Where you been? And I realized I haven't been home enough, so it was time to step down. But Pat is a very special person who had a wonderful vision, who kept understanding at the individual, putting time in, worrying about those with mental health issues, substance abuse issues, family issues. That was the key to society, and it was just great to see him come in and in no way be all fired up for another week or so of, this is why I got elected. So thank you very much. It's very nice, Pat.
My last remark is to say that there is another person who was really the secret of Pat's success, Lily. I'd like to say when I met Lily, it was in 1967 in Omaha, Nebraska, where she was running the rehabilitation program for children. And he was the mental health director for community mental health, the program that we had started at NIMH. And I fell in love with Pat, before I'll get to Lily, because I was being recruited by Cecil Whitson, who was the czar of mental health and psychiatry in the state. And the job offer was for mental health commissioner, state hospital superintendent, mental health planning director, and research director. And I got scared to death that Omaha was too small after New York, Brooklyn, and Omaha. And I'll never forget Pat Okura, who was president of the Urban League, says, our riots are just as good as your riots in Washington, and they're just as tough to figure out. What do you think? And when I realized that he understood that the riots in Omaha were as tough and good as the riots that we were dealing with in Washington, D.C. when it was burning, I fell in love. And then came Lily, and then when we watched her, she would have been, I'm not using this symbolically, the Hillary Clinton of the JACL. If things were different or moved faster in the culture of the JACL, she would have been the first woman president. I want you to know she had that kind of smarts. And I figured that she had a mysterious smarts, and I finally found out by happenstance, and this is an anecdote probably that most of even my most intimate people don't know. My neighbor in Chincoteague, Virginia, where we lived for 20 years, was John Golden. Very distinguished man, journalist, had been a special assistant to President Truman, and he'd been the head of National Public Radio in Washington, and his executive assistant was Lily Okura. It took me years to find out that he was basically full-time CIA. You may not know that CIA had front agencies like NPR where they actually did a good job. And Lily, I want you to know, was able to be the executive assistant to the National Public Radio and CIA chief in Washington. That's the kind of woman who was behind Pat Okura. So with that, I'm going to hand this back to you, the new young Pat Okura, Ford Cura Motor.
And I just want to introduce Glenn Komatsu, who will make the introduction of our special speaker.
They wanted me to, they gave me this job, so they figured I couldn't screw this up. It's, you know, it's always nice to introduce somebody that needs no introduction. You just have to mumble a few words and kind of get out of the way. You know, you all know Norm Mineta. You know, he was a mayor, congressman, secretary of commerce, secretary of transportation. But I did have to say a few words because for me it's personal. You know, Uncle Pat and Auntie Lily were my family. And I grew up listening to the stories, their stories about pre-war Los Angeles, about the camps, about Boys Town, working with Father Flanagan, the JACL, you know, moving to Washington, D.C. and working with Bert at the NIMH. And that was really part of the fabric of my upbringing. You know, that he and Norm were friends was not surprising because they're obviously two of the significant leaders of their generation. So it started all, of course, with my grandparents and listening to their stories. And then, you know, as I grew up, you know, I began connecting the dots a little bit more. The Issei really were so courageous in coming over to a foreign country with very strange customs, trying to forge a better life. You know, they taught us the sense of community that we've tried to maintain. But it was really the Nisei that had the larger task and the bigger vision. The Nisei had to bridge the two cultures who, at the time, were at war with each other. And by the way, they were going to take away all your basic human rights while you try to bridge this gap. You know, they really were part of the greatest generation, as accurately described by Tom Brokaw. There's no question about that. And not only did they survive, but they thrived. When they came back from the war, they got jobs, they finished their education, and they tried and they worked incredibly hard to really create for us, the next generation, the Sansei, very stable and nurturing homes and families so that we could pursue our dreams and really know no limits like they had known. So that's really a tough act to follow, right? Can't really follow that act. But we can carry on their legacy with our children and our children's children and keep their stories alive and really continue to try to do good work to make them proud of us. So I just want to have you join me in welcoming one of the greatest generations, Norm Mineta.
Glenn, thank you very much for your kind and generous introduction. I think I'm here because I may not be the oldest in the audience, although close to it, but I've probably known, except for relatives, Pat the longest. And that friendship came through my sister and her husband, my sister Etsu Masaoka and Mike Masaoka. And that goes back to the 40s. And so, you know, I used to always think of that Irishman, Pat Okura. And so, how he would always try to pull that one off. But Pat was one of those who was in a field that was not really well known in the Japanese American community and culture. First of all, it's an area in which if you admit to something, it's a stigma. People want to stay away from that. But Pat was one of those who kept talking about it all the time in terms of especially with the evacuation and internment and the whole process of trying to rebuild lives in that post-World War II period, whether they were veterans coming back from the 442nd or the Military Intelligence Service, or people who had experienced 4 years of camp life, earning really very little, if any, income at that time, and having to try to rebuild their lives. And so there were very few who were in the area of mental health to really assist the Japanese American community. And yet this was an early burning thought of Pat's from his days at UCLA. And when you follow that work pattern of where he went and the jobs he held, and as each move was made, it was another move to a broader area to get more exposure for people to learn more about mental health. And to me, when I see pictures of the 1963, I think it was, Civil Rights March, and there's Pat very prominent in the front of that parade. And so you think of Pat and Lily, because to me, Pat and Lily was one word. You didn't separate the two. They were together all the time, and it was complementary in the sense that where one left off, the other picked up. And it was a great team. And there was nobody who was more gracious as a hostess than Lily. And especially in putting out those desserts that she would put out at functions. She was just great at desserts. But in any event, through the years, and I've had the chance to be with Pat, and I remember when I was in the service and I was going cross country with a couple of fellows in the car, and so we stopped off in Nebraska to see. I said, I'm not sure where Pat Okura is, except that he's at Father Flanagan's Boys Town. And I really didn't know where it was at the time. And someone found out and said, okay, let's just go there and meet him, see him. And we did. And it was just fun to see Pat in a different setting. And then, of course, when he moved to D.C. and having a chance when I was here in those early days and seeing him was a great experience. And I learned so much about, I guess, organizational structure and the way you go about lobbying. And his was really, in the truer sense, an educational mission. And, but I saw him do this with people he didn't know, to convince them as to why it was important that certain things get done. And so a lot of us benefited just from watching Pat work. And then when all of you came up with the idea of the foundation and seeing then the fellows of the Okura Foundation was, to me, eye-opening. And that's sort of the pattern that I used in forming the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, because there were only 5 of us in the Congress at the time, and we could meet in the phone booth somewhere. And but Pat really had these organizational skills to be able to lay out a pattern on how to do things. And I used to call Pat, especially when we set up APACS, the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies. And by that time, Pat was having a tough time in his own right, but he was still very generous with his time and his thoughts about how to make APACS work as the private sector agency to help the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. So to hear that this is now the 35th anniversary is just really heartening to see the legacy that Pat Lilly left and to see all these fellows and see what they're doing today is even more heartening. I know that when our son got his MSW, the first thing you think is, what's David going to do with it? But he built, as executive director of a drug abuse treatment program and prevention program, a very successful program in San Mateo County, and that's what finally, I think, attracted the attention of some people in White House personnel to ask him to come back to be the Deputy Director for Demand Reduction in the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy. And I always think that Pat would just be busting his buttons to know that David is now in that position. Because when I came here first in '74, David was just a little kid, but we'd always be at JCL picnics and other community events with Pat and Lily. And I'm quite sure that Pat's background in his professional career spurred David in terms of his work, in terms of mental health, but specifically with drug abuse, addiction, and treatment. And of course, Ford helped David along the way too, in terms of the confluence of Ford's professional endeavors and the interests that David had. But a lot of this, again, is just attributable to Pat encouraging young people to pursue a field of study that was not highly regarded, I think, basically within the Japanese American community. And, you go off to be a lawyer, CPA, an engineer, mathematician, MD, whatever. But MSW was not one of those recognized fields that people would say, yeah, my son's an MSW. Really? Is it fatal? So, but Pat was one of those who kept encouraging young people. And so more and more, the people in the Sansei in the 3rd and 4th generation went into it. And I remember early on, after the Clintons were elected, and Mrs. Clinton was trying to put together her the whole issue of the health plan. And so Patsy Mink, Bob Matsui, and I were trying to get an appointment with the people of, with Mrs. Clinton or her staff. Couldn't get an appointment. And yet the Congressional Black Caucus would call and boom, bingo, had a meeting. Hispanic Caucus, call, bingo, a meeting. So I finally said, we've got to form a caucus. And here, the 4 or 5 of us formed this caucus. It was really in paper, but it was there in name. And we called and said, this is the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. And Patsy Mink and I, as co-chairs, would like to meet with Mrs. Clinton. Of course, when would you like to meet? Oh, wow. And again, when you think about the seeds that Pat planted with all of us and encouraged us. And of course, he had a close friend by the name of, I know many of you know him, Dr. Ray Murakami. But Ray was also part of that whole entourage to encourage with Pat people in the Japanese American community here to not just be insular within the Japanese American community, but to be visible and take your interests and press upon the majority community why you're there. So again, all of us have thanks that we owe in debt to Pat and Lily for what they did to us. And when I see all of the kinds of areas that Asian Pacific Americans have gotten into, it just is amazing. I remember speaking in Philadelphia at the National Association of Asian Pacific American Bar Association. And I asked the executive director at that time, Les Chin, how many APA attorneys are there in the country? That was not 2007. He said 47,000. And you remember, you probably know not only from your own experience, but in the old days when Asian Pacific Americans went into a law practice, they were a one-person law firm. And they didn't do much more than the kinds that one-person law firms do. Today, they're corporate general counsels, magistrates, federal judges. I mean, they're all over the place. And not only that, today there are 53,000 attorneys that are APA. And those are the opportunities that have been opened up by Pat and what he was pushing at the time. And I know that all of us are really thankful to Pat and Lily, to Bert and to others to help us all not only just be insular in terms of our own interests, but more expansive in dealing with the majority community. So again, I just want to thank you for this opportunity to share a few thoughts about Pat Okura, that Irishman.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Norm. And Bert? Bert, do you have any closing remarks you'd like to offer? Okay, great. So then, what I'd like to do is I'd like to thank all of you for coming and participating. Some of you came from out of town a long ways, and we really appreciate you sharing with us this opportunity. And please feel free to linger and chit-chat and reminisce as long as you'd like. As we said, we do have the video cameras available, so if you'd like to leave your comments and/or oral history, there's an opportunity to do that. So with that, I'd like to thank you all again for coming and bid you good night and safe travels home. Thank you.
One of my strong memories of Pat was when I was a fellow with him. He turned to me and he asked me, "So what are you doing tonight, tomorrow?" And he said, I said, "Well, I think I'm going to go check out the new Franklin D. Roosevelt memorial." And he quietly said, "Well, I don't think I'll be doing that." And he very quietly expressed his opinion about the man who had signed the executive order that sent all the Japanese Americans into the internment camps. But I don't. He didn't embarrass me, but I did understand his position, and I think that's the kind of way he did things. He was able to state his opinion in a very powerful way, a very understanding way. So that's what I remember.
Pat and I led a delegation to China, and it was in the early 80s, I think it was 1983. Someone said that Pat never got angry. Well, he had to do some disciplining on that trip. He was a very good sergeant at arms. I remember that. Once we were all around the dining table, and we were eating, and we didn't know what we were eating, and our Chinese host, who had a sense of humor, said, "I don't know, arf, arf." But it was just great to be with Pat in another part of the world.
All right.
So the week in Washington that Pat and Lily brought me to was my first real experience in Washington, D.C., and it really changed everything about the way I was thinking about things. And the following year, I moved here, and Pat and Lily got me on the JCL board, and everything was history. It was such a great learning experience to be able to see them in action all the time. So I really appreciate them. And I don't know if they ever knew this, but I dedicated my dissertation to them.